When investigators examined the wreckage of the Cessna Citation 550, they found both thrust levers in the full forward position, maximum power. The pilot had pushed the throttles all the way forward, demanding everything those Pratt & Whitney engines could give. And yet the GPS data tells a different story. On final approach, the aircraft's airspeed dropped from 114 knots to 93 knots in approximately 30 seconds. Full throttle. Decelerating. 1,380 feet short of the runway, 7 people dead. I've spent hours analyzing this data, trying to understand a simple question. If the engines were producing full power, why couldn't they climb? December 18, 2025. Statesville Regional Airport, North Carolina. A Cessna Citation 550 prepared for what should have been a routine flight to Sarasota, Florida. 7 souls aboard. Dennis Dutton, a retired Delta captain with 17,000 hours, in the left seat. His son Jack, a private pilot with 175 hours in single-engine aircraft, in the right seat. Greg Biffle seated in the cabin. His wife Christina, their daughter Emma, 14, their son Ryder, 5. Craig Wadsworth, a family friend. The weather was marginal, ceiling around 3,900 feet broken, 4,800 overcast. Heavy drizzle was moving through the area. The aircraft was fully fueled and ready for a flight that would never reach its destination. Instead, 9 minutes after takeoff, it would crash 1,380 feet short of the runway it had just left, with both thrust levers commanding maximum power. The flight departed at 10:06 a.m. Problems appeared almost immediately. The left engine had been difficult to start. A thrust reverser indicator light wasn't working. During the takeoff roll, Biffle commented that the left engine appeared to be producing more power than the right. Dennis continued the takeoff. Jack attempted to contact Atlanta Center 3 times to activate their instrument flight plan. No response. The controller was too busy. By 10:10, multiple instruments on Dennis's side of the cockpit had failed. The autopilot disconnected. The altitude indicator malfunctioned. The Garmin GPS stopped recording airspeed and heading data. Dennis transferred control to Jack while he troubleshot the electrical problem. At approximately 10:14, Biffle asked about the alternator. 4 seconds later, the instruments came back online. Dennis confirmed that was the problem. They had found it. They had fixed it. But now they were low and slow, trying to get back to an airport they could barely see. The GPS data resumed recording just after 10:14. What it captured in those final 90 seconds tells the story of an approach that was never going to work. The aircraft rolled out on runway, heading at approximately 1,240 feet altitude and 114 knots indicated airspeed. For a Cessna Citation 550 on final approach, 114 knots is workable, not optimal, but survivable. The reference speed for this aircraft on approach is typically around 108 to 115 knots, depending on weight and configuration. They were in the ballpark. But then the airspeed began to bleed off. Over the next 30 seconds, altitude and airspeed both decayed steadily. The aircraft continued toward the runway threshold, but it was descending faster than it was covering ground. In the final 5 seconds of recorded data, the indicated airspeed briefly increased to 107 knots, then dropped to approximately 93 knots. 93 knots is dangerously slow for a citation on approach. The aircraft was approaching stall territory. Here's the contradiction that demands explanation. Both thrust levers were found in the full forward position. Maximum power commanded. Both engines remained attached to the aircraft. Fan blade damage was consistent with rotation at the moment of impact. The engines were running when they hit the ground. There was no evidence of uncontained engine failure. So why was the aircraft decelerating with full power applied? Why couldn't a twin-engine jet with both engines producing thrust arrest a descent that was clearly becoming critical? The answer lies not in whether the engines were running, but in when the power was applied and what aerodynamic situation the aircraft had already entered. If you're finding this analysis valuable, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We break down aviation accidents like this every week, going deeper than the headlines to understand what the evidence actually shows. Now let's talk about what full throttle actually means in a situation like this. When a pilot advances the thrust levers to full forward, the engines don't instantly produce maximum thrust. Jet engines have what's called spool-up time. The turbines need to accelerate from their current RPM to maximum RPM. Depending on the initial power setting, this can take anywhere from 3 to 8 seconds. If Dennis had been flying the approach at reduced power, perhaps trying to manage a descent that was already too steep, and then recognized the aircraft was too slow and pushed the throttles forward, those engines would have been accelerating toward full power, but not yet producing it. There's another factor that makes low-speed situations in jets particularly dangerous. As airspeed decreases, induced drag increases dramatically. This is the drag created by the wings as they generate lift at higher angles of attack. At 93 knots, with landing gear extended and flaps deployed, the Citation would have been operating at a high angle of attack to maintain lift. The drag at that speed and configuration would have been substantial. Even with both engines at full power, the aircraft may have been in a condition where thrust could not overcome drag quickly enough to accelerate. This is sometimes called being behind the power curve. The aircraft needs more power to maintain speed than the engines can provide at that moment. And once you're behind the curve, recovery requires not just adding power, but also reducing drag, often by lowering the nose and sacrificing altitude you don't have. The evidence suggests this wasn't an engine failure, it was an energy management failure. The aircraft arrived on final approach without sufficient energy to complete the landing. The time spent troubleshooting the electrical problem, the distraction of failed instruments, the workload of flying an unstabilized approach in marginal weather, all of it consumed the crew's attention while the aircraft's energy state deteriorated. By the time they recognized how slow they were, by the time they pushed the throttles forward demanding full power, the aircraft was already in a condition that full power alone couldn't save. Think about the cockpit environment in those final seconds. Dennis had just regained working instruments after several minutes of electrical failures. He had the runway in sight. Jack was providing visual guidance. The gear was down. The flaps were deployed. They were configured for landing. Everything looked like it was coming together. But the airspeed was bleeding away. 114 knots, 110, 107. The sink rate was increasing. The approach lights were getting closer, but they weren't getting closer fast enough. At some point, Dennis must have recognized the aircraft was too low, too slow. He pushed the throttles forward, full power. The engines began to spool up, but 93 knots at 1,380 feet short of the runway, in a descent that had been unstabilized from the beginning, there simply wasn't enough altitude or time for full thrust to save them. The Cessna Citation 550 is a capable aircraft, but it has limitations. Its approach speed requirements are well documented. Its engine performance characteristics are well understood, and the physics of flight don't care about how experienced the pilot is or how desperately they need the aircraft to climb. At 93 knots, with gear and flaps extended, in a descent toward terrain, full throttle was the right input. But it was the right input applied too late in a situation that had already become unrecoverable. The thrust levers found full forward aren't evidence that the engines failed. They're evidence that Dennis Dutton recognized the danger and did exactly what a pilot should do. He just didn't have the altitude to wait for those engines to save him. The aircraft struck a 29-foot-tall approach light structure, approximately 1,380 feet from the runway threshold. It continued through additional light towers and trees before coming to rest in the runway overrun area. A post-impact fire consumed most of the fuselage. Both engines remained attached. Both thrust levers remained full forward. The physical evidence tells us that in the final moments, the pilot was fighting for altitude with everything the aircraft had. He wasn't giving up. He wasn't accepting the outcome. He was commanding maximum power from engines that were still running, still producing thrust, still trying to lift an aircraft that had already run out of sky. The regulatory requirement for 2 qualified pilots exists precisely for situations like this. When instrument failures demand troubleshooting, when weather creates workload, when an approach becomes unstabilized, the second pilot monitors energy state, while the first works the problem. Dennis Dutton's type rating required a qualified second in command. Jack wasn't qualified. That meant Dennis had to troubleshoot the electrical failure while also flying the aircraft, while also managing an approach in deteriorating weather, while also monitoring airspeed and altitude. The workload was distributed across 3 pilots, but only one of them was trained for this aircraft. And when the energy state decayed to dangerous levels, then may not have been anyone with enough bandwidth to notice until it was too late. If you want to see our analysis when the final NTSB report comes out, subscribe now. We'll be following this investigation to the end. What should pilots learn from this? First, energy management is everything on approach. Airspeed, altitude, and sink rate must be continuously monitored, especially when other emergencies are demanding attention. Second, full power doesn't mean instant power. Jet engines take time to spool up. Recognize energy state problems early enough to allow time for the engines to respond. Third, an unstabilized approach in marginal weather after multiple system failures demands a go-around. The runway will be there on the second attempt. Fourth, crew qualifications matter most when workload spikes. The regulations exist because emergencies require 2 sets of trained eyes. Follow them. Greg Biffle spent his retirement doing remarkable things. When Hurricane Helene devastated western North Carolina in 2024, he flew his own helicopter into affected areas to rescue stranded residents. He used his skills and resources to help people when they needed it most. That's who he was. His wife, Christina, his daughter, Emma, his son, Ryder, Craig Wadsworth, Dennis and Jack Dutton, a father and son who went down together. 7 people who trusted that airplane to take them to Florida. The thrust levers found full forward tell us Dennis Dutton fought until the end. He recognized the danger. He commanded full power. He did what a pilot is supposed to do. But 93 knots and 1,380 feet short of the runway, full throttle couldn't save them. Understanding why, understanding that energy management failures can make even working engines useless, is how we prevent the next family from suffering the same fate. If this video helped you understand what happened, share it with a pilot who needs to see it.